It's 8 o'clock at night. I've actually been up since about 7 o'clock in the morning. Took me a little bit to get through editing the longer vlog from yesterday. And I've really been procrastinating for the rest of the day because I'm afraid to go over into the other room. I've been through this before. You think it's fixed, and you're afraid to face the possibility that it's not. I am going to make my way in there shortly and do a little bit of mixing overnight. Um, but there's been a huge attack in France. No word yet on who caused it. I'm just watching the stream from the CBC up here in Canada. It's just streaming on their website. I don't I don't get TV at all here, so um, this is how I would watch TV. But obviously, the media is jumping into conclusions. There are indications that the people involved were radical, quote unquote, Muslim extremists. Here's the thing that doesn't imply anything. Um, if if the Americans wanted to launch an attack in China, they would send in, people with dark skin that were dressed as Muslims. Um, any actor at all would make an attack look like it was a Muslim attack, um, because there's anybody is going to view it as plausible. So what you need to do to determine who is responsible for something like this it is not to look at the evidence at face value, because anybody at all is going to stage it that way. But number one, look at possible motives, and number two, look at what these groups actually say. The reality, and I went over this after 9/11. Um, it was always very strange that Al Qaeda or Osama bin Laden, none of them. I mean, there was never any indication of any responsibility. Um, the United States never released any kind of hard evidence tying them to the attack, and that's very unusual. Um, Terrorists or terrorism as a tactic is meant to if you're dealing with an actual terrorist attack, the terrorists involved are going to take responsibility. They want you to know that they were responsible for it. That's the whole point. This idea of a terrorist attack being done by an organization and then them denying it or avoiding responsibility, that doesn't make any sense. And I'll tell you flat out right now that if this was actually a terrorist attack, we'd already know who did it because they would have already taken responsibility for it. Um, there's been no indication of anybody at any point near the Middle East taking advantage of this. So the authorities may come out and say one thing, um, and that's there will be various motives for that. But it's like, as I stated, if this was an attack by a group like ISIS, then they would have already taken responsibility for it. They have not. Um, it makes no sense that they would do an attack by stealth. They would want you to know that they did it, and they would want to tie legitimate demands or legitimate conditions, or even just open fear mongering to the to the attack. That's the point of a terrorist attack. So it's pretty clear that's not what's going on here. Um, that doesn't mean you have to jump to the black helicopters right away. There are other explanations. One explanation is that you're dealing with kind of a group of lunatics. This looks like it's organized, so that's probably a little bit lower on the list of possibilities. But there was an attack in Canada last year. Um, the media claimed it was ISIS. It was some crazy person that thought they were acting on behalf of ISIS, probably didn't understand what ISIS even was. And when you see these sorts of things, that's, something you have to keep in mind. This seems unlikely. Um, what seems most likely is that this has something to do with the climate um, talks that are about to open in Paris within a few days. It's I believe COP 21, and it's it's widely expected to produce legitimate binding targets. There's been a lot of things attached to that. It seems clear that somebody doesn't want that to happen. So, if you look at the possible um, culprits here, you've got private interests, such as oil companies. They need to be taken into consideration. And of course, if you were an oil company and you wanted to derail a climate talk, you would make it look like an attack by Muslim extremists. That's what you would do. Um, the other possibility is NATO itself. I think I mentioned 9/11. I don't think the Americans attacked themselves on 9/11. To be honest with you, I think the most likely, um, I think it was the Germans. I know that that's a little bit out of nowhere. If it comes up somewhere else, maybe I'll explain my theory on that. But I think that it was the Germans that were doing it specifically to crash the economy in the United States, to install the euro as a reserve currency. Um, so, I mean, and I don't think that France would do this. Do I think that it's possible that the United States may have something to do with this, kind of in the background? It's not impossible. I would need to see a lot of evidence to be convinced of that, but it's not something that should be ruled out a priori. Of the major actors, I think the more likely one is Russia. Um, we know that it seems that these are trained operatives. They demonstrated behavior of a trained operative. Apparently, they were operating with Kalashnikovs. That itself is not. That's not uh, what's the word I'm looking for here? A steaming gun, or a Canadians. We don't even know our gun lingo. Um, it's not clear. I mean, again, if you were if you were the American Secret Service and you were trying to set something up, you would give them Kalashnikovs. But um, if the Russians wanted to kind of make it, um, if they wanted to send the message for people that were paying attention that it was them, then that's what they would do. Or it could just be sloppy planning. And you would think the Russians are more likely to fall into sloppy planning than the Americans would be. Um, the Russians have a history of this. Um, there was the ClimateGate thing a few years ago where Alex Jones got all this data that came to them from Russian servers. Um, I think it's absolutely clear as day that Alex Jones is a KGB agent or an agent of whatever has succeeded the KGB. That's another talk that we can have one day, if it comes up. But they've done this before. I mean, not this, but they've derailed climate talks before. Um, this is something that might not show up in the media for a long time. In fact, it might not show up at all. Um, but that's my best guess as to what you're seeing here. Again, if it was an attack from um, an extremist group somewhere in the Middle East, they would have taken responsibility. The fact that they did not fairly clearly rules that out. And there's not really any mental gymnastics that you can jump through. There's really no scenario where ISIS would carry out an attack like this and not take responsibility for it. There is a scenario where they might take responsibility for it without having actually carried it out. Um, so, I mean, from what we've seen here right now, it's pretty clear to me that you can safely rule something like ISIS out. It also seems clear to me that you can rule out the lone, uh, you know, nutcase theory because it seems too orchestrated. Um, it strikes me as very unlikely that the French would be directly involved, and I can't see any particular reason why the Americans would react like this. If their aim was to derail the talks, they could have um, reacted a little bit less. Um, this is too much of an overreaction, I think, for it to be a possible American attack that leaves the most likely suspect with the strongest motive and the strongest history of derailing climate talks to be the Russians. And if that's the case, this is going to be very interesting to see how it unfolds. That said, I expect the media to pick up the ISIS line, however absurd it is. Yeah, this came out this morning. Threats from ISIS to attack Russia. That's a that's a bold threat. A couple of loonies in Syria think they're going to take down the Kremlin. But at the very least, it's a serious threat of terrorism being unleashed in Russia. Now, if you know what really is going on in the region, you know that ISIS is essentially a Saudi proxy carrying out Saudi aims with, at the very least, American blessing. The idea is to fold various Russian proxy regions into a growing Saudi nexus of power that stretches from Libya to Iraq, anyways. The idea is to pull Syria specifically into that sphere and out of Russian influence. So the way Russia would interpret this is that there's a threat from the West to launch attacks in Russia. So it does make sense for them to react preemptively, I suppose you could say. Who knows how much of this gets into the press or how people understand it or what. But that is my take on what just happened in Paris. It's a preemptive Russian strike on Western threats to carry out terrorist attacks in Russia through the vector of the Islamic State. Um, we'll probably just be told it was Al Qaeda or ISIS. Um, I think it's maybe a little bit much to expect a bunch of yahoos in the desert to pull off, or people in a bunker. And where's Al Qaeda even located nowadays? Um, they quote unquote killed um, Bin Laden. Are they in Afghanistan, Pakistan, uh, Egypt, even? Who knows? But this seemed a little sophisticated for a network like that. Um, I mean, who's going to be able to smuggle Kalashnikovs into France besides the Russian FSB? It's actually pretty obvious if you really look at it critically. But yeah, that's my take on that. It's pretty clear. So it's 11:30, and I finally got the courage to come in here and give this a listen. Let's see here. I'm gonna try it with this one first. I think it'll really let me know almost immediately. Yep, it sounded good. Alright, I'm good to go.